Principal called black student unteachable, in front of parents. MIT acceptance letter, arrived next morning. Let me be direct with you. Since you've driven all the way here, your son is unteachable. Principal Darren Whitfield said it the way men say things they have said before, in the flat, rehearsed tone of someone delivering a finding rather than an opinion, a man who has confused his own certainty with evidence so many times that the two have become the same thing. He did not lower his voice. He did not close the conference room door more firmly. He said it in the glass-walled meeting room, just off the main office of Hargrove Academy. With the hallway visible through the window behind him and 3 other people in the room, one of whom was a 16-year-old boy sitting very still in a plastic chair, with his hands folded on the table. The boy did not flinch. He looked at a fixed point on the wall, behind Principal Whitfield's left shoulder, a small rectangular mark where a picture had hung for years before someone took it down, and he held his eyes there, with the specific concentration of someone who has learned to give their attention to something that cannot be taken from them. His mother sat beside him. Patricia Okafor had taken a half-day from the hospital where she worked as a patient care technician on the cardiac floor, a job that required her to be present, quiet, and competent in rooms where the stakes were very high and where no one ever said thank you. She had worn her good blouse, the deep blue one she reserved for parent-teacher conferences and church, and the 2 funerals she had attended in the past year. Her hands were folded in her lap, and the skin across her knuckles was tight. Her husband, Emmanuel, sat on the other side of their son. He was a tall man who moved carefully in spaces built for smaller people. A man who had grown up in Lagos and come to the United States at 23, with a degree in electrical engineering and a suitcase that weighed 40 pounds, and had arrived to find that his degree required recertification, that his accent required explanation, and that the job he was qualified for required 10 years of domestic experience he could only get by doing the job, which required 10 years of domestic experience. He had built his way back up methodically, over 11 years, and he now supervised a maintenance engineering team at a water treatment facility in the western suburbs. He sat with his forearms on the table, and his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man who is doing the arithmetic of what he is and is not permitted to say. Their son Ezra was 16 years old and had a graphite smear on the outside edge of his left hand, the kind that belongs to people who write quickly from left to right and drag their palm through what they have just put down. He had 2 composition notebooks in the backpack beside his chair. He had been in the middle of a problem when his father had knocked on his bedroom door that morning and said they had been called in. He has been given every resource this school offers, Principal Whitfield continued. He has had 3 different learning support plans, 2 reading intervention cycles, and a full semester with our specialist. None of it has moved the needle. At some point, we have to have an honest conversation about fit. He used the word fit the way it is sometimes used in schools, as a word that means something the speaker is not willing to say directly, a container for a conclusion that is easier to carry in a euphemism than in its actual form. He glanced at Ezra when he said it briefly, the way you glance at a piece of furniture you are describing to a buyer. Ezra did not look back. He kept his eyes on the mark on the wall. Hargrove has a responsibility to the students who can benefit from what we offer, Whitfield said. Ezra's profile, he paused, as if choosing the word profile were itself a courtesy, suggests he would be better served by a program more suited to his pace. Patricia Okafor said very quietly his pace. Academically speaking, yes. He reads at a post-secondary level, Emmanuel said. His math teacher sent us an email last spring saying he had outpaced the curriculum. Whitfield made a small, patient sound, the sound of a man who has heard objections from parents before and has a category in his mind where they all go. I understand that parents see their children in a particular light. That's natural and it's appropriate. But the assessments tell a different story. Which assessments? Emmanuel said. The standardized evaluation suite that the district requires. Ezra has consistently underperformed on measures of processing and academic retention. He has ADHD, Patricia said. The accommodations in his IEP have not been. We have followed the IEP to the letter, Mrs. Okafor. I want to be clear about that. Emmanuel said. Then I would like to see the documentation showing how the accommodations were applied. Because what we have seen at home does not reflect, Mr. Okafor. Whitfield's voice did not rise. It did something else, a kind of flattening, a withdrawal of engagement, the tone of a man who has decided that the conversation is over and is waiting for the other people in the room to reach the same conclusion. I have been in education for 22 years. I have worked with hundreds of students. I am not telling you something I haven't had to tell other families, and I understand it is not what you want to hear. But your son is not capable of performing at the level this school requires. He is not equipped for this environment. That is not a judgment. It is an observation. He straightened the folder in front of him. He looked at the Okafor family with the expression of a man who has delivered a verdict and considers the delivery of the verdict to be an act of professionalism. Ezra looked at the mark on the wall. His breathing was even. His hands were still folded on the table. The graphite smear on his left palm had dried to a light gray, the color of early morning over Lake Michigan. Somewhere in his backpack, folded into the back cover of his second composition notebook, where he kept things he was working on, was a 37-page proof. He had been refining it for 4 months. He did not mention it. But someone else was about to mention it for him. And Principal Darren Whitfield had approximately 14 hours before the world he was certain, he understood, was going to look entirely different. He sat there, 16 years old, 2 composition notebooks in his backpack, a 37-page proof he had been working on for 4 months. And he sat there and let that man say unteachable in front of his parents without a single visible reaction. We are going to talk about what was in those notebooks. We are going to talk about the email that arrived the next morning. But first, you need to know who Ezra Okafor is, because that conference room did not contain the story Darren Whitfield thought it contained. Let's get into it. Ezra Okafor was born in Evanston, Illinois, the second of Emmanuel and Patricia's 3 children, sandwiched between his sister Adeze, who was 19 and studying nursing at DePaul, and his brother Kofi, who was 11, and had recently developed a consuming interest in competitive chess that had reorganized the household's Saturday schedule entirely. Ezra was the quiet one. Not quiet in the way of sadness or withdrawal, but quiet in the way of internal weather, the kind of person whose most significant activity is invisible from the outside, who is doing something complex and absorbing in the space behind his eyes, while the rest of him looks like nothing in particular is happening. He had been diagnosed with ADHD at 9, after a second-grade teacher named Mrs. Alderman had called Patricia at work to say that Ezra had spent the entire math unit drawing geometric shapes in the margins of his worksheet rather than completing the problems, and that she was concerned about his ability to focus. Patricia had come in the next morning to talk to Mrs. Alderman, and she had brought the worksheet with her. The geometric shapes in the margins had been a series of tiling patterns, arrangements of pentagons and hexagons and irregular quadrilaterals that fit together without gaps across the width of the paper. Mrs. Alderman had looked at the worksheet for a long moment, and then looked at Patricia, and said that she was still concerned about Ezra's ability to focus, which was true, and also that she was not sure she had the training to address what was in those margins, which was also true. The ADHD diagnosis had come 3 months later, confirmed by a pediatric neuropsychologist, who had, at the end of the evaluation session, sat across from Emmanuel and Patricia, and said that their son had processing differences in certain attention regulatory areas, and also that his spatial reasoning score was in a range she rarely saw, and that she would be interested to know what he did with it. What Ezra did with it, primarily, was mathematics. Not school mathematics, which he found tolerable but slow, like being asked to walk a route he could run. Real mathematics, the kind in the books he found at the Harold Washington Library in the city, which his father drove him to once a month on Saturday mornings. Books with titles like Introduction to Combinatorics and Principles of Mathematical Analysis and Number Theory. A friendly introduction, which was not as friendly as it claimed, but which Ezra read in 3 weeks, and whose problems he worked in a composition notebook with a red cover that he started at 10 and filled completely at 12. He had filled 9 composition notebooks by the time he was 16. The current one, the one in his backpack, was the 10th. His school performance was uneven, in the way of someone whose mind runs on a frequency that classroom structure is not built to receive. He was capable of sitting through a literature discussion and absorbing every nuance and saying nothing, then writing a response to the prompt that his English teacher described in a margin note. as unlike anything I have received from a student at this level. He could also sit through a 45-minute standardized test and answer 20 questions, while spending 15 minutes on a single problem, not because he was stuck, but because he had found something in the problem that was more interesting than the answer. A structural pattern in the way the question was built that led somewhere the test maker had not intended. He got that problem wrong. The test logged it as an error. The error counted against his score. His standardized testing profile was, by most rubrics, mediocre. His actual mathematical ability was not. The gap between those two things had been causing problems at Hargrove Academy since the first week of ninth grade. The first problem had been with his English teacher, a man named Mr. Prentice, who ran his classroom with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided, after many years, exactly how much deviation from expectation he is willing to tolerate, which was very little. Ezra had submitted his first analytical essay of the year, and Prentice had returned it with a C+ and a margin comment that said sentence level. Sophistication does not substitute for structural discipline. Ezra had read the comment. He had gone home and reread the essay. He had written a second version that was organized precisely to Prentice's stated rubric, and that was, by every measurable criterion, inferior to the first. It had received a B. He had understood from that exercise that Prentice was not teaching him how to think more clearly. He was teaching him how to fit a particular shape. Ezra had decided to fit the shape in Prentice's class and to think clearly everywhere else. He had passed with a B- and had not enjoyed a single day of it. The second problem had arrived in October of ninth grade, when the school's guidance counselor, a woman named Ms. Berardi, had called Ezra in for what she described as a routine academic check-in. She had his file open on the desk between them. She had his standardized testing history, his grades from middle school, and the psychologist's evaluation from age 9. She had asked him how he was finding the transition to high school, and he had said fine, and she had asked if he had given any thought to the vocational track electives the school offered in addition to the standard curriculum. Because, she said, some students found that hands-on learning environments gave them more room to succeed. She said hands-on with a particular emphasis, the kind that communicated that she had already made a decision about the appropriate category, and was now moving through the motions of the conversation. Ezra had looked at her file and at her, and said that he was interested in the mathematics and science track. She had made a note and said she would look into what was available. She had not followed up. His parents had followed up. Emmanuel had emailed Ms. Berardi 3 times over the following 6 weeks, requesting confirmation that Ezra had been enrolled in the standard mathematics track and not redirected to a vocational sequence. The first 2 emails received no response. The third received a reply from Berardi's supervisor, the school's academic dean, who said the matter had been reviewed and that Ezra was correctly placed in the standard track. The email did not explain why 3 follow-up requests had been required to confirm a standard placement. The third problem had been in the spring of 9th grade, when Ezra's algebra teacher, a woman fresh out of her credentialing program, who was doing her best with 31 students and a room where 3 of the desks did not adjust correctly, had submitted a referral to the Learning Support Department, noting that Ezra demonstrated inconsistent mastery of procedural skills and recommending a supplemental assessment. The assessment had been administered on a Thursday morning in a room with 4 other students, a proctor who came in 15 minutes late, and a buzzing fluorescent tube that no one had replaced. Ezra had completed 14 of the 22 problems. The ones he had not completed were not ones he could not solve. They were the ones where he had found the interesting structural thing inside the problem, and spent the available time going there instead. The assessment had confirmed the referral's concern. It had been added to his file. It had become part of the documentation that Principal Whitfield had cited in the conference room when he said the assessments tell a different story. The 4th problem had been the most direct. At the start of 10th grade, Hargrove had implemented a new academic tracking system in which students were assigned to one of 3 tiers for mathematics: advanced, standard, and supported. The assignment was based on a composite score derived from standardized test results, prior year grades, and teacher recommendations. Ezra's composite had placed him in the standard tier, 1 level below the advanced track where the mathematics would have actually been interesting. to him. DeWolf had submitted a written request for review of the placement, noting Ezra's demonstrated ability in independent mathematical work. The request had been reviewed by Ms. Berardi and the academic dean, and returned with a notation that the placement was appropriate based on available documentation, and that alternative placement would require a formal reevaluation process with a 60-day lead time. DeWolf had submitted the reevaluation request. The 60 days had elapsed. The reevaluation had been scheduled and then rescheduled twice due to the specialist's availability, and then completed in November of 10th grade, 10 months after the original placement. The result had been a recommendation for advanced track placement, beginning the following academic year, which was now the year after Whitfield had called Ezra unteachable. The placement had never taken effect. Through all of it, through Prentice's rubric, and Berardi's vocational suggestions, and the buzzing fluorescent tube, and the 60-day timeline, and the placement that had never materialized. Ezra had not complained to his parents about most of it. Not because he did not notice, but because he had made a private determination, somewhere in the fall of 9th grade, that the school was not where his real work was happening, and that investing significant energy in contesting its mechanisms was energy taken away from the composition notebooks and the Thursday afternoons. He had compartmentalized with the specific practicality of someone who has decided which room matters and is not going to lose the room by fighting in the hallway. His parents had not been entirely unaware. Patricia had noticed the silences, the contained quality of Ezra's answers when she asked about school, the way he would say fine in a register that meant something more complex than fine, but that he had decided not to unpack. She had followed up on the things she could document, the IEP accommodations, the placement review, the academic track request. She had fought those fights carefully and on paper, because she had learned from her first year of navigating this school that verbal conversations disappeared and written records did not. What she had not fully known until the morning of the conference room meeting was the accumulated shape of all the small things, laid end to end, that Whitfield had been using to build the foundation for a conclusion he had reached before the meeting started. Emmanuel had known this from the time Ezra was 11. He knew it with the specific confidence of an engineer, not a parent's hope, not an emotional conviction, but an observed and verified fact based on what he had watched his son do with problems that required genuine technical thinking. He had brought his son a textbook from a friend's university bookshelf once, an undergraduate real analysis text, and left it on Ezra's desk without explanation. 2 weeks later, Ezra had come to him with 4 pages of notes on the first 3 chapters and a question about the Cauchy convergence criterion that Emmanuel had not been able to answer fully and had needed to look up. Patricia had fought for the IEP. She had requested it in 2nd grade, been told to wait, requested it again in 3rd grade with documentation from the neuropsychologist, been told the evaluation process had a queue, escalated to the district office in 4th grade, and finally received the formal plan in 5th grade, 3 years after she had first asked. The plan included extended time on assessments, the option for oral responses in place of written ones for certain tasks, and a note that Ezra should be provided with alternative means of demonstrating comprehension when standardized formats produced inconsistent results. At Hargrove Academy, the plan had been honored in the way that some plans are honored, on paper, and at a measurable distance from its spirit. Ezra received extended time on district-mandated tests, which he did not need for the reasons the test designers assumed and which he used. More often than not, to go back through problems he had already answered and find the interesting structural thing inside them. He did not receive oral response alternatives because the process for requesting them was a form that needed to be submitted per class, per semester, and the form was not in the places the handbook said it was, and by the time Patricia had tracked it down and submitted it, the semester was over. He did not receive the alternative assessment formats because the specialist assigned to support him had changed 3 times in 2 years, and each time a new specialist arrived they began the intake process again. What Ezra received, in practical terms, was a binder of documentation that traveled with him, and which most of his teachers flipped through briefly at the start of each year, and then set on a shelf. What he also received from his 9th grade physics teacher, a man named Mr. DeWolf, who wore the same pair of brown corduroy trousers 3 days a week, and who had taught AP Physics for 19 years without once pretending. A question was stupid, was an invitation. DeWolf had caught Ezra after class one afternoon in the spring of ninth grade. He had kept the class's most recent problem set. He had put Ezra's on the desk between them and pointed to problem 6, a free body diagram problem that Ezra had solved correctly, but had also extended, without being asked, into a generalized parametric analysis of the force relationship across variable coefficients of friction, filling half the back of the page with notation that was not remotely within the scope of the assignment. This part, DeWolf said, pointing to the extension. Where did this come from? Ezra had said it was just the interesting part of the problem. DeWolf had looked at it again. He had looked at Ezra. He had said, "Have you ever thought about mathematical physics?" Ezra had said he had been reading a book about topology. DeWolf had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "Come back Thursday after school." Those Thursday afternoons had continued for the rest of ninth grade and all of 10th grade. DeWolf had cleared a shelf in his classroom supply closet and let Ezra use it for his notebooks. He had ordered 3 books from the university library system and checked them out under his own name and left them on the shelf for Ezra to use. He had, at the start of Ezra's 10th grade year, read a paper in a mathematics education journal that made him sit forward in his chair and then stand up and walk to his window and stand there for a while thinking. The paper described a problem in combinatorial graph theory that had been open for several years. The author, a professor at MIT, wrote that it was particularly suited to exploration by advanced secondary students because the barrier to entry was relatively low. It required no more than a strong grasp of discrete mathematics and linear algebra, but that no one had found a clean solution. The paper had been written partly as an invitation. DeWolf had printed it and then left on the shelf in the supply closet with a post-it note that said, "Worth looking at," that had been 14 months ago. Ezra had looked at it. He had looked at it for 4 months before he wrote a single thing down. He spent those 4 months doing what he always did when he encountered something unfamiliar, reading around the edges of it, building the scaffolding of understanding before approaching the structure itself, filling his 10th composition notebook with definitions and examples, and failed approaches and one-line observations about why the approaches failed. He had not told anyone he was working on it. He had not told DeWolf. He had not told his parents. He had said, when his mother asked what was in his notebook one Sunday evening, that he was working on a problem. The 37 pages in the back cover of his 10th notebook were a complete solution. He had not yet shown them to anyone when he sat in the conference room with Principal Whitfield and listened to a man tell his parents that their son was not equipped for this environment. He looked at the mark on the wall where the picture used to be. He thought about the problem. He thought about the clean geometric logic of the solution, the way all the pieces had locked together in the 3rd week of October like a door, closing properly, the specific satisfaction of that closure, which was not loud and did not announce itself but which sat in him like a frequency, like the resonance that stays in a room after a note has ended. Whitfield was talking about transition resources. He was talking about a program in the district designed for students who needed a different kind of support. He was using language that had been developed over many years to communicate removal from a school without using the word removal. Patricia said, "I want this meeting documented." Whitfield said, "Of course, we follow all documentation protocols, in writing, sent to me, with the specific language that was used today." There was a pause. "I'll have my assistant prepare a summary." "Not a summary," Patricia said. "The language that was used. Specifically." Whitfield looked at her. He looked at Emmanuel. He looked at Ezra, who was still looking at the mark on the wall. He made the small, patient sound again. The sound of a man managing a situation he considers beneath his professional level. "Mrs. Okafor, I understand this is a difficult conversation. I've tried to be honest with you because I believe families deserve honesty. That's all I've done today." Emmanuel stood up. He was 6'2", and he moved carefully in spaces built for smaller people. And he stood up in that glass-walled conference room and buttoned the middle button of his jacket and looked at Darren Whitfield with an expression that communicated without a word a comprehensive assessment of the man in front of him. "We'll be in touch," Emmanuel said. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Ezra stood. He picked up his backpack and slung it over one shoulder, the strap loose the way he always wore it, and he walked out of the conference room and into the hallway, and down the corridor toward the exit doors, and he did not look back. Outside in the parking lot, the October air was cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes Chicago look like it was designed for this particular light. Ezra got in the back seat of his father's car. He took his notebook out of his backpack and opened to where he had left off, because the problem in the conference room had resolved itself the way those problems sometimes did, by sitting with it long enough for the logic to clarify, and there was a particular line in Section 4 of the proof that he wanted to revisit. Patricia watched him open the notebook from the front passenger seat. She watched him pick up his pencil. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs and looked forward through the windshield at the parking lot and said nothing for a long moment. Then Emmanuel started the car, and they drove home. Man, he got in the back seat and opened his notebook, because the proof was still in there, and it still needed attention, and what Whitfield had said was not going to change what was on those pages. And Ezra Okafor had learned, somewhere in the space between second grade and 16 years old, the most important thing, in a world that has made up its mind about you, that other people's conclusions about you have no jurisdiction over your actual work. The letter arrived the next morning. Let's talk about what it said, and who sent it, and what happened when it got to Hargrove Academy. Ezra had submitted the proof 4 weeks earlier. DeWolf had found it on the shelf in the supply closet, slipped inside the back cover of the 10th notebook that Ezra had left there after a Thursday session, and he had read it standing up, still in his coat, because he had come in early to set up for a lab and had detoured to the closet out of habit. He had read the first 5 pages standing. He had sat down in his desk chair on page 6. He had read the remaining 32 pages twice. Then he had called his former graduate school advisor, a professor of discrete mathematics at Northwestern, and read him 2 paragraphs over the phone, and the professor had said, "Hold on, who wrote this?" And DeWolfe had said, "One of my 10th graders. He is 16 years old." And the professor had been quiet long enough that DeWolfe had said hello. And the professor had said, "Get me the full document." DeWolfe had, with Ezra's knowledge and his parents' signed permission, transmitted the document to his Northwestern contact. The Northwestern professor had read it over a weekend and sent it to a colleague. The colleague was a professor of mathematics at MIT named Dr. Susan Akebe, who specialized in combinatorial theory and who had written the paper about the open problem, the invitation that DeWolfe had left on the shelf 14 months earlier. Dr. Achebe had received the document on a Monday. She had responded to the Northwestern professor on a Tuesday. Her email used the phrase, "I have never seen this from a secondary student," in a way that, in academic correspondence, carries more weight than it might appear to on the surface, because academics are trained to understate. She had then done something that surprised even DeWolfe, who had hoped for interest but had not expected the velocity of what followed. She had contacted Hargrove Academy's main office the same week, asking to be connected to whoever could facilitate a conversation with the students. Family. That message had gone to a general inbox. It had sat there unread for 11 days. In the meantime, Dr. Achebe had also initiated the preliminary review process for early admission consideration at MIT's Department of Mathematics. MIT offered a small number of deferred enrollment and early track admission pathways for exceptional candidates, identified outside the standard high school senior cycle. The process was deliberately rare. It had been used 11 times in the department's history. It required faculty sponsorship, independent verification of the submitted work, and a review committee recommendation. Dr. Achebe had submitted the sponsorship documentation on a Wednesday. The verification and review had taken 3 weeks. The committee had met on a Thursday. The letter had been processed Friday. It had arrived in the Okafor family's email inbox at 7:14 the following morning, while Emmanuel was making coffee, and Patricia was dressing for her shift at the hospital, and Ezra was at the kitchen table with his notebook open, working through an extension of the proof that had occurred to him in the shower, a generalization into higher dimensional graph structures that the original paper had not asked for, but which the logic of the solution seemed to invite. Patricia saw the email first. She was passing through the kitchen with her bag over her shoulder, checking her phone for the bus schedule, and she stopped walking. She read the email. She read it again. She set her bag down on the kitchen floor and put both hands flat on the kitchen counter and stood very still for a moment. Ezra looked up from his notebook. He saw his mother's face. He had not seen that particular expression on her face before, but he recognized its family. The compressed, inward look of something that is too large for the features to contain immediately. "Mama?" She picked up her phone and held it out to him without speaking. He read the email. He read the subject line. MIT Department of Mathematics, Exceptional Candidate Early Admission Review. Ezra Okafor. He read the first paragraph, which established the review committee's process and the faculty sponsorship. He read the second paragraph, which described the submitted work and the committee's assessment. He read the sentence, "The committee unanimously and without reservation recommends Ezra Okafor for early admission to the MIT Department of Mathematics to begin study at the commencement of his 17th year, contingent upon the standard health and enrollment documentation outlined in the attached materials." He read it twice. He looked at his notebook, which was open to a page of new notation. He looked at the email again. He set the phone carefully on the table. Emmanuel came to the kitchen doorway with his coffee and saw his wife's face and his son's face and said, "What happened?" Ezra said, "I think I got into MIT." Emmanuel set his coffee cup on the counter. He looked at his son for a long moment. He walked to the table and picked up the phone. He read the email. His jaw moved once, the way it moved when he was calculating. He set the phone down. He put both hands on the table, leaning on them, and he closed his eyes. And then he opened them, and he said, "Emmanuel Ezra Okafor," which was his son's full name, which he used only in specific circumstances, and then he stopped speaking and pressed his lips together hard and put his hand on the back of his son's head. Patricia had not moved from the counter. She was still pressing both palms flat against it, and her eyes were wet, and she was looking at her son with an expression that Ezra would spend a long time trying to find the right word for, and eventually decide that no single word was adequate. Kofi appeared in the kitchen doorway in his school uniform, rubbing his eyes, and said, "Why is everyone in the kitchen?" And nobody answered him for a moment, and then Ezra said, "I got into college." And Kofi said, "You're in 10th grade." And Ezra said, "I know." And Kofi went to the refrigerator and got the orange juice out and poured himself a glass and considered this information with the equanimity of an 11-year-old who finds that adults are frequently doing things that are surprising and that breakfast continues regardless. DeWolf found out at 7:52 when Patricia called him from the parking lot of the hospital and said the words MIT and Ezra and early admission in a sentence that she had to repeat because her voice had not fully stabilized yet. DeWolf sat down on the stool behind his classroom demonstration table and said, "I knew it. I knew it the moment I read those pages." Then he said, more quietly, he knew it too. He just needed someone to give him the table. The email from Dr. Achibi's office at MIT was followed, within 48 hours, by a second email directly to Patricia and Emmanuel, with Dr. Achibi's personal address and a request for a video call at their earliest convenience. The video call happened 2 evenings later, with Ezra at the kitchen table, and his parents on either side of him, and Kofi banished to the living room with his chest set. Dr. Achibi was a woman in her mid-50s with close-cut natural hair and the direct, unhurried way of speaking that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms full of brilliant people and have reached the conclusion that clarity is the only real courtesy. She had a copy of the proof in front of her. She asked Ezra 3 questions about the methodology and listened carefully to all 3 answers. After the third, she looked at him over her glasses and said, "The extension into higher dimensional structures. Are you already working on that?" Ezra said yes. She said, "Bring it when you come." Hargrove Academy was not officially notified until the following week, when Patricia and Emmanuel submitted the formal enrollment documentation to MIT's office and included a copy of the admission letter to the district's academic affairs coordinator. The coordinator forwarded it to the principal's office. It landed on Darren Whitfield's desk on a Wednesday morning. His assistant would later describe him as having read it at his desk without speaking for approximately 3 minutes, which was longer than she had ever seen him engage with a single piece of paper. At 11 o'clock that morning, Whitfield's assistant sent an email to Patricia Okafor requesting a meeting. Patricia called back rather than emailing and said she would not be returning to Hargrove for a meeting without a written agenda provided at least 5 days in advance. documentation of the basis for any items on the agenda, and confirmation that the meeting would be recorded. These were, she noted, the same documentation standards Principal Whitfield had assured her the school followed. There was a pause on the phone. The meeting was agreed to. The written agenda was provided. When Emmanuel and Patricia arrived, they brought DeWolf with them, because DeWolfe had requested to be present, and because they had agreed that a witness was appropriate. They brought Ezra, who brought his notebook and sat in the same chair as before, with the same composure, except that this time the thing folded in the back cover of the notebook was not just a proof. It was a printed copy of the MIT letter, creased from having been folded once, and unfolded several times over the course of a week. Whitfield opened the meeting by saying that he wanted to express the school's pride in Ezra's achievement, and to acknowledge that the school's assessments had not captured the full picture of Ezra's abilities. Emmanuel waited for him to finish. Then Emmanuel said, "I would like you to say, specifically what you said in this room 2 weeks ago, the word you used." Whitfield looked at his folder. "The word unteachable," Emmanuel said. "I would like you to say it now, in this room, to my son's face, in the context of his admission to MIT." There was a silence that had the texture of something structural failing slowly. Whitfield's assistant was in the room taking notes. DeWolf was in the room watching. Patricia was in the room with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on Whitfield with an expression of complete attention that communicated nothing, except that she intended to be fully present for whatever happened next. Whitfield said, "I recognize that the language I used 2 weeks ago was inappropriate and did not reflect. I did not ask for a characterization of the language." Emmanuel said, "I asked you to say the word." Another silence. Mr. Okafor, "I think we can all agree that the purpose of this meeting is to—" "The purpose of this meeting," Emmanuel said, "is the one stated on the agenda you provided, which is to discuss the school's formal response to Ezra's achievement, and to address the documentation my wife requested of the prior meeting. I am asking, as part of that discussion, for you to acknowledge specifically what was said, in front of my son, who is sitting right here." Whitfield looked at Ezra. Ezra looked back, not at the mark on the wall this time, directly at Whitfield. His face was the face of a young man who has nothing left in this room to prove and who knows it, and who is, as a result, completely free of the need to perform anything at all. Whitfield said slowly, "The word I used was unteachable. I understand now that it was inaccurate and unjust, and I thank you," Emmanuel said. He did not add anything to it. He let the two words close the space where Whitfield had been speaking, and then he turned to his son and nodded once. A small nod that meant something between "I see you" and "it is done," and Ezra nodded back. The formal statement Hargrove Academy released the following week acknowledged Ezra's achievement and described the school as proud to have been part of his journey, which was not true, but which was the kind of statement that gets issued when the alternative, a more accurate accounting, is too costly to put in writing. The statement did not mention the conference room meeting. It did not mention the word that had been said in it. The district's academic affairs office opened a review of Hargrove's IEP compliance practices 2 weeks after the MIT letter was formally received. The review was requested by 3 families, the Okafors and 2 other families who had, upon learning of the MIT admission and the circumstances around it, submitted their own documentation of IEP noncompliance through the district's grievance process. The review was assigned to an outside auditor. It was still in process when the Okafors left Evanston for Cambridge 6 months later. Darren Whitfield submitted a resignation from the principal role at the end of the academic year, citing a desire to transition to district-level consulting work. The announcement was made in a staff email on a Friday afternoon. Several teachers responded. Several did not. DeWolf read the email and went back to grading papers. The district, as part of a settlement with the 3 families, funded a new IEP compliance coordinator role, specifically assigned to monitor accommodation delivery and audit plan implementation on a rolling basis. The position was the first of its kind in the district. The Okafor's attorney had proposed it as part of the agreement. Patricia had agreed on the condition that the coordinator's annual report be made publicly available to families. Before Ezra left for Cambridge, DeWolf cleared the supply closet shelf and gave him the books that had been checked out under DeWolf's library card for the past 14 months. He said they belonged with the work. He said he was sorry it had taken so long for the school to see what he had seen the first Thursday. Ezra said the Thursdays had been enough. DeWolf did not say anything to that. He put his hand out, and Ezra shook it, and they both looked at the empty shelf for a moment, before Ezra turned and walked down the hallway and out, through the exit doors into the October air, which was cold and bright, and designed for exactly this light. Patricia came to the supply closet doorway a moment later. DeWolf was still looking at the empty shelf. She said, "He's going to do things we can't imagine." DeWolf said, "I know," she said, "because of those Thursdays." He shook his head. "He would have found it. I just gave him a table." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Every kid in that school needs someone who gives them the table." And DeWolf said, "Yes." And they both stood with that truth for a moment in the doorway of the supply closet. Because some things are true enough that they do not need to become louder to carry the weight they carry. Emmanuel took the day off work to drive Ezra to the airport. Patricia took a full day, not a half day. Adeze drove up from Chicago the night before and stayed over and made jollof rice, because jollof rice was what the family made for significant occasions, and they ate it late at the kitchen table, with the radio on low. Kofi asked Ezra if he could have the composition notebooks that were staying behind. Ezra said no. Kofi said he was just going to use them for chess notation. Ezra said no, but with less conviction. Patricia told both of them to finish eating. At the airport, Emmanuel stood at the security line entrance with his hand on his son's shoulder for a long moment. He did not say anything large or arranged. He said, in Igbo, the phrase his own father had said to him at Lagos Airport 22 years earlier, the phrase that meant go forward, which in its literal form says go and become what you are going to become, and which in the context of a father and a son standing at an airport contains everything that has ever been passed between them and everything that is too large to say and everything that is not yet but will be. Ezra picked up his backpack. He slung the strap over one shoulder, loose, the way he always wore it. He walked through the security entrance and did not look back, because looking back is for people who are uncertain about what is ahead. And Ezra Okafor had known for 4 months, since the 3rd week of October, since the moment the proof had closed like a door settling into its frame, exactly where he was going. In his backpack, in the back cover of the 10th composition notebook, was the printed MIT letter folded once. Beside it, in a small envelope his mother had slipped in the night before without saying anything, was something else. A card in his mother's handwriting. On the front she had written his full name, Emmanuel Ezra Okafor. Inside she had written 4 words, "You were always enough." He would not open the envelope until he was on the plane, at cruising altitude, somewhere over Lake Erie, with the clouds below him and the sky above him, the specific deep blue that belongs to altitudes, where the air is thin and the light is clean and the world below has receded to a scale where its borders are not visible. He would read the 4 words twice. He would fold the card carefully and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the back cover of the notebook beside the printed letter, and close the notebook and hold it on the tray table in front of him with both hands for a moment. Outside the window, the Great Lakes were visible far below, enormous and blue-gray, older than any idea any person in any conference room had ever had about what a 16-year-old boy could or could not do. He opened the notebook to the new work. He picked up his pencil. The graphite smear on the outside edge of his left hand was already forming, the small gray mark of someone moving quickly from left to right across a page, putting down things that were true. I need to sit with this for a second, because Patricia Okafor went to that first meeting in her good blue blouse. She took a half day from the cardiac floor. She sat in that glass-walled conference room and heard the word unteachable, and she did not escalate her voice and she did not walk out. She asked for documentation. She asked for the language specifically. She filed it. She went home, and she watched her son get in the back seat and open his notebook. And she did not say to him, "You were right," or "They were wrong," or any of the things that would have been true. She just watched him work, because she had always known what was on those pages. And DeWolf. The corduroy trousers, the Thursday afternoons, the supply closet shelf, the books checked out under his own library card for 14 months. He did not fix the system. He did not reform the IEP process or correct the principal. He gave a table, 1 cleared shelf, and 1 Thursday afternoon a week for 2 years. That is what it took for the world to find out what Ezra Okafor already was. Here is what I want to know, and I want you to put it in the comments right now. Who was the person in your life who gave you the table? The teacher, the coach, the neighbor, the librarian, the uncle who put a book on your desk without explanation. Who was it, and what did they give you? Because those people are real, and they are in schools right now, and some of them are reading this, and they should know what their Thursday afternoons do. Drop it below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit the like button and subscribe, because there are more stories coming. Stories about people who were told what they couldn't do and built the proof otherwise. Stories about patience, and about tables, and about the specific kind of quiet that belongs to people who already know where they're going. This story is fiction, but Darren Whitfield is in a real school, and so is Ezra Okafor, and so is DeWolf in his corduroy trousers, clearing a shelf in a supply closet that changed a life. That's the realest thing I know how to tell. We'll see you in the next one.